Even when she was born in Boston, Massachusetts, at this point, we are not really sure if Susanna Hurlich is American, Canadian, Angolan, or Cuban. She is without a doubt a citizen of the world. Susanna arrived to Cuba for the first time in the 70s. At some point of her life, she decided to stay and live in the island. As an anthropologist, she worked for decades in Baracoa, and now she is really committed with the activism for the animal rights. Mother Nature is a big part of her being, and her conservation should be taken into consideration by us all. With Susanna Hurlich, we have the pleasure to talk today in From Havana. Well, Susan, thank you so much for accepting this conversation. This is not an interview, it's a conversation about you, your life, and our country. It's a common country, I believe.
Thank you for inviting me.
Tell me about your childhood. You had pets when you were a kid. You were a not normal kid, but a regular kid, or you were like a fire barrel when you were a kid.
I was very much a tomboy.
Okay.
I grew up with animals, all kinds of animals, cats, dogs, turtles. When I was the middle of three children. I had two brothers, one on each end.
Male, both of them.
Both brothers, yeah. When I would go to camp, my parents, I found this out much later in my life, my parents would write a detailed letter to the director of the camp saying, please do not allow, this would be summer camp, please do not allow our daughter to bring home any of the following animals. And they would have 3 pages of lists of every single animal, because any animal I loved and I would try to bring home. When I was little, I would ride my bike a lot. I would play baseball with the boys.
I heard.
And one time I got a carrot because I found a huge turtle on the street. And I got a carrot on a piece of string and attached it to the back of my bike and rode very slowly home, and the turtle came behind. And my parents said, where did that turtle come from? And I said, well, he followed me home. They called up the zoo. The zoo had no idea where the turtle came from, but they took the turtle to the zoo, and the turtle got a good home.
Did you ever succeed bringing animals home?
Oh, often. I would bring home kittens and puppies, and I'd want to take care of them. For me, to look into the eyes of an animal is to fall in love.
You were born in Boston, right?
I was born in Boston, spent the first 11 years of my life in Boston. When I was 11, my family moved out to San Diego, California. I thought it was just on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. I had no idea what 3,000 kilometers, miles
That's
were.
the West
miles
Coast.
then. West Coast.
Yes.
From the East Coast to the West Coast.
Yeah, that's totally different weather, time zone, everything.
Everything. We had a collie named King, Sir Stafford King, because we lived on Stafford Road. And he came with us in the car. We had a station wagon, and he was trained to stay in back. But every time we went over a bump, he'd jump to the next seat and jump to the next seat. So I finally went back and sat with him in the back of the station wagon.
When you say a collie, is like Lassie, the
collie,
dog?
Exactly like Lassie, a beautiful dog. Yeah, and very well trained.
You had, I remember we were talking before behind cameras that you went to a contest, a boat modeling contest.
It was a woodworking contest.
Woodworking.
When I was a kid, and this was again before we moved to San Diego, so I was 8, 9, 10 years old. Every 4th of July, there would be a big event in a big park that was kind of across the street from us. And the kids would decorate their bicycles. My brother and I would always win. He decorated his bike one time as a boat. I decorated my bike one time as Pegasus. There was a woodworking contest, only for boys. And I thought, that's not fair, because I worked with wood. I worked with my father and he always did all the woodwork in the house. And I made a beautiful little horse, but they wouldn't let me enter it. So I changed my name to Sam Hurlich, because on the boys' baseball team, they called me Sam and not Susanna.
Okay.
Because they said, if we call you Sam, we treat you like one of the boys. And I entered the contest, my beautiful little horse. It was a 3D horse made out of different layers of plywood that I glued together. And I won first prize. And when they called me up to get the first prize, Sam Hurlich, and I stood up and I went up The judges were horrified. You're a girl. And I said, of course I'm a girl. I've always been a girl. And they said, well, you lied to enter this contest. And I said, I didn't lie. I thought it was and I explained that it was very unfair because I said, boys can do what girls can do and girls can do what boys can do.
You prove it.
And it's really unfair that girls who also love wood and work with wood can't enter a woodworking contest. At any rate, they gave me the first prize because all the parents were applauding. The parents were there with their kids. And the next year on, the woodworking contest was open to boys and girls.
That was in front of an audience.
It was in front of, of kids.
When you stood for your rights, it was in front of the judges and the audience.
Oh, yeah.
And how old was you at that moment?
I was probably 9 or 10.
So you were...
But I had a very strong sense. I mean, we didn't have even the language or the concept of women in development or gender.
Yes.
That came 30 years later. But I, at a very young age, I had a very strong sense of fairness.
Because of your family, or just because the sense of the world that you had at that time?
I think it came more from me. Some of it came from my family, but it came more from me. Just a really strong sense of fairness. I remember I was 14 years old the first time that Fidel came to the United States. This was on April 21st, 1959. This was when he left the hotel that had been assigned him and he went to Hotel Teresa in Harlem.
Yes.
And the next year in September, he went to the United Nations. And I was 14 years old, 15, but already Cuba captured my imagination.
You were in California at that time, already.
I was in California at that time. That's right. That's right.
You played baseball, you told me a little before. In a male team?
I played every sport you can imagine. In my high school, when I was a kid, I was in a boys' team because the girls didn't play baseball. The girls, this is Nanichi.
Nanichi.
Which is a Taino word that means my heart because her black spots look like a heart. Her nickname is Nietzsche, and she speaks Spanish because she's a Cuban cat.
Maybe she can talk later
she probably
if she
will.
wants.
She probably will. At any rate, in high school, junior high school, I played baseball. I was captain and pitcher and the pinch hitter for the girls' baseball team.
Okay.
I played tennis in high school. I was a member of the boys' tennis team because we didn't have a girls' tennis team. I was allowed to practice with them, but I couldn't compete. But they considered me and treated me as a member of the team because I was a good tennis player.
That's fair. I mean, they had a conscience of
that's right.
equality.
That's right.
Important.
That's right. And even when I broke my leg, which I broke at that time, I had a cast on, but I would still play tennis. I would stay in one spot, and I could hit the ball anywhere. But they had to hit it back to me. So it could be forehand, it could be backhand, so it was very good practice for them.
Talking about that equality mentality, that consciousness that people start to have at some point in the United States, you went to Berkeley.
I did my undergraduate work in Berkeley, starting in 1963.
Which is a really effervescent moment of the social history in the States.
It was an extremely effervescent moment, and the University of California in Berkeley was one of the most effervescent moments of all. It was the time of Haight-Ashbury. It was the time of People's Park. This was during my first year. It was the time of the young university students, Berkeley on the West Coast, the University of Chicago on the East Coast, organizing very, very strongly against the Vietnam War. We, because of a lot of the actions that we were doing as university students, we had police occupations, we had tear gas. That was my first experience in 1963 with tear gas.
So you faced the police at some point?
Oh yes, oh yes. We would go around with flowers because some of the police had rifles.
This is a really famous picture with a flower in the cannon.
Exactly, and a lot of us went around with flowers. That was a famous picture.
Yes.
I wasn't the rifle that I put the flower in. But a lot of us were putting flowers in the rifles. Our response to violence was peace. Let there be peace. At any rate, it was also a time, I started out my university studies in mathematics, physics, and chemistry, which I loved and which I still love. I wanted to be a subatomic physicist.
At that point, it was a really male-ish career, some sort of speaking.
Mainly, but it wasn't rare. It was uncommon, but not rare to have women. But I was brilliant in those areas.
I don't doubt it.
And then I had a dream. I had a dream one night. This was halfway through my first year at university. I was sitting on a mile-high laboratory chair looking down a telescope that had a mile-long neck. And it felt very cold, and it felt very lonely. And I woke up the next day, and I went to speak with the vice dean, and I told him, I don't want to be a subatomic physicist. I love subatomic physics, but I want something that's more peopled and noisier. He tried to talk me out of it.
Of course.
He said, you can't make decisions based on dreams. And I said, if we don't make decisions that are also based on dreams and something we're reaching for, what do we base life on? What do we base a future on? And I eventually settled for anthropology, because anthropology, the study of human beings, how we make societies, the most important thing that social and cultural anthropology teaches, in my view, is humility. Because leaving aside fascism, exploitation, capitalism, imperialism, there are so many ways to be human. There are so many ways to name the universe. There are so many ways to love and make families and make societies that you have to learn. If you don't learn, there's something wrong with you. That yours is only one of many. And it teaches you humility because of the variety of being human. That's the most important thing that I've learned as a social and cultural anthropologist.
Well, anthropology took you to several places in the world in your life. Before you came to Cuba, you were in Canada because you was against the war and the government, so you went to Canada, then you went to Africa, and then you arrived to Cuba. How was that trip in your life? How do you
In 1963, I and my then husband, we went to Canada as part of the 60,000 young Americans who were fleeing the draft and who were opposed to the Vietnam War. Another 80,000 went to Sweden. In Canada, when I was in graduate school, during my first years, because as an anthropologist, one of my strong studies were the political struggles of Indigenous people, Aboriginal peoples in the United States and Canada. And for a period of time, I actually worked with what's called Grand Treaty Number 9. It's for the Cree-Ojibwa people in Northern Ontario who were putting together a lot of documentation for their land claims.
Okay.
I then did my graduate studies in Southern Africa because I became very active in solidarity movements with the liberation movements in Southern Africa. We worked very closely with MPLA in Angola, with SWAPO in Namibia, with the African National Congress in South Africa, with FRELIMO, with PAIGC in Cabo Verde and Guinea-Bissau.
There was in a conflict moment, I mean, in moments of conflict and war in those regions.
It was during the war period, and we not only were supporting those movements, we were making the link to struggles back in Canada. For instance, Gulf Oil in Canada was receiving the oil from Angola to politically launder it, to then send it down to the United States. So in working with the liberation movements in Southern Africa, we also always tried to make the link with struggles in Canada. It's very, very important. I then did my graduate field work in Namibia. And there's an interesting connection here because in 1976, I read the, in 1973, I read the first report that was prepared by the United Nations indicating all the international companies that in violation of the blockade of Namibia were involved in Namibia. And I was struck by the fact that one of them was the Hudsons Bay Company, because the Hudsons Bay Company has a historic and extremely notorious role in its exploitation of Indigenous peoples in Canada. I wanted to learn more about it in Namibia and found out that the only thing that was known about it was that little paragraph in the United Nations report. So I turned that into my doctoral thesis. I had to fight with my committee because my committee said, no, anthropologists have to go off and find their people, their tribe, etc., and study them. And I fought for it. I said, no, what I am doing is not studying a nation, an indigenous nation, not tribe, an indigenous nation. I am studying the corporations that are exploiting that. I fought for it and I won that.
It was a different approach of the...
Yeah, and I turned that into my PhD studies, the Hudsons Bay in Namibia. I got access to the Hudson Bay facilities. I took the first photos that were ever taken inside the facility. I presented myself to the management of the Hudson's Bay because South Africa apartheid was very paternalistic. So I presented myself as an innocent, cute little girl, right? And I told them I have an older brother, which is true, who was a sheep raiser because the Hudson's Bay was working with Karakol, Southwest African sheep, that were imported under the Germans when they occupied Namibia from the steppes of the Soviet Union. And I presented myself as the sister of a sheep farmer and how interested he would be. And they said, oh, well, we'll take you in so you could see it. Because meanwhile, I had studied sheep raising in Canada, in the United States, so I could do that. And so I took photos. I was taken around by the vice director. I had already, with the assistance of SWAPO, done a lot of interviews with the migrant laborers from northern Namibia who were exploited laborers. They knew I would be going, and they knew they shouldn't recognize me. And the management also facilitated for me to go to what was a closed auction of the Southwest African caracal pelts in England. So I took those first photos, and then in Canada and in England, we turned all that work with various solidarity groups into an international campaign against the Hudson's Bay Company in Namibia. And for a year in Canada, I was interviewed several times a week by all the Canadian broadcasting companies for the northern, in Aboriginal communities, for the northern programs. They would interview me, and I'd speak very calmly and based on facts and details, and then they'd always follow it by the vice president of the Hudson's Bay Company in Canada. For years, I was afraid to go into the Hudson's Bay Company because he was so nasty. I thought they'd arrest me.
It was dangerous. And when was the first time you stepped on Cuban soil?
I first came to Cuba in January of 1978, for the first 2 weeks of January. I came here as an invitado. I kept a diary of everywhere I went. I still have that diary with addresses and what I did and people I met, and I've since seen some of them. And this was at the time that Cuba was sending the Venceremos Brigade for a year, consisting of high school students from Cuba and high school professors who were going for a year to Angola to work in the countryside helping to teach literacy, because Angola was 95% illiterate when it became independent in 75. That was the first time I came to Cuba. The second 2 weeks of January of the same year was the first time I went to Namibia and to Angola as well. Yeah.
And when did you decide to stay, to make a life here in Cuba?
30 years ago, I was still living and working in Angola, but the security situation was so complex.
Yes.
With UNITA that it was compromising the work I did. It made it difficult for me to work because I did a lot of work in the countryside. And so I decided to come to Cuba for a year, for 2 years, and then go back to Angola. But I came to Cuba, this was right at the start of the special period, actually.
Yeah,
but the special period, people thought I wouldn't survive the special period in Cuba. And I said, survive the special period. I've been living in Angola for years, where every morning at 4:30 I'm getting my water in a bucket, where the last 6 months there were grenade launchers outside in the alley behind the apartment. I said, you know, the special period here, that's not difficult. I'm very used to that. At any rate, 1 year became two became, and I've been here for 30 years. I have been back to Angola and Southern Africa since then. I went into Cuito Carnival, actually with Siswe Recontre,
yes.
the armed branch of the African National Congress. We went up from South Africa through Namibia into Angola. But Cuba is where I live.
You have a lot of cats. I mean, 7 cats, and I know you will have more if you can. You are really committed with animals and with the animal protection movement here in Cuba.
This is Peugeot. Let me say something very quickly in relation to that. I wouldn't say I am an animal protector. I would say I'm a nature protector, because like cats and dogs and horses and birds, we too are the sons and daughters of Mother Earth. If we don't take care of the mother, all the children die.
Of course.
Including us. My kitties teach me some very important things every day. One, they teach me that like them, I too am a child of Mother Nature. And two, they remind me constantly about equality. Equality and respect and justice is not just between people. It is between people and nature. If we don't have respect for nature, if we don't take care of it, we're not taking care of ourselves.
Of course.
So to love and take care of animals is also another expression of, it's part of loving and taking care of human beings and helping to build a better world for all, be they 2-legged, 4-legged, feathered, finned, whatever.
That brings me to my last question. We have a new constitution for the last 3 months, sort of. Do you think we do enough to protect the animals here in Cuba? The government, I mean.
In terms of policy?
Yes.
Okay. The Cuban policy in general, in relation to the environment, and in relation to Tarea Vida, the life task, 100-year plan to deal with the problems that are coming with climate change, is one of the most impressive in the world. I was one of hundreds of thousands of Cubans who fought to have a principle included in the Constitution that recognized the rights of animals, not just cats and dogs, all animals, because we also need to be concerned about the productive animals, about the work animals such as horses. It was a huge disappointment to all of us that that principle was not included in the Constitution. It is a huge gap. I happen to have the same view as Mahatma Gandhi. You judge a nation and the level of civilization by its care, concern, and articulated principles in relation to animals. So what this means in terms of animal rights is La lucha continúa. The struggle continues.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you and learn from you. It's been a pleasure for me and all the team of Telesford.
And thank you very, very much. I think you're doing wonderful work with this program.
Thank you.